This video is with Change Creation, and the purpose of it is to explore ways in which we might develop new business plans and models fit for our times. And with me, we have Dawn Langley, Karen Turner, Andrea Nixon and Anna Dinnan. And first of all, I'd like them to just give us a quick introduction, and then I've got some questions for them around this topic. So Dawn, could you introduce yourself first of all?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I'm a researcher and organisational development practitioner, working mainly in the creative and cultural sector, but I also work across the public sector and a small amount in the private sector as well.
Thank you, Dawn. Karen?
I'm Karen Turner. I work part-time as the Executive Director of the National Youth Theatre, and then otherwise as a consultant with People Make It Work on the Change Creation Programme and in other contexts on often organisational development, organisational change, fundraising, and often capital projects.
Thank you very much, Karen. And Andrea?
I'm Andrea Nixon, and I'm a consultant with People Make It Work and also on my own. And prior to doing that, I was Executive Director of Tate Liverpool for 12 years, led the gallery through a major change programme. And for the past 18 months, I've also been chairing the board of the Everyman and Playhouse Theatre in Liverpool and taking that through similarly major change.
Thanks very much, Andrea. And Anna?
Hello, I'm Anna Dinnan, and I'm a freelance consultant, and I work mainly around business planning and organisational change, and also some work with funders around policy and programme development. I've been freelancing since 2016, and before that was with Nesta, and before that did a long stint in the organisational development team at Arts Council England.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. So the topic of this video is to think a bit about creating a new business plan model fit for our times. During this video, we'll be exploring some questions around what such a model might look like, how we might achieve that at this moment of uncertainty, and sort of arriving hopefully at a sense of some of the stages that we might all need to go through with our teams in our organisations to reimagine the way that we're going to work and be sustainable in the future. So my first question is that when we're business planning, I think we're often working with change. At this moment, what scale of change are we talking about? Dawn, would you start us off?
Yeah, I think, as you say, a number of us have worked through kind of various types of change in the past, but there is something, and I know it's very well worn at the moment, but it is absolutely unprecedented at the moment. The fact that organisations, over a matter of weeks, have had to completely reorientate themselves, and that many teams are now working predominantly remotely. Those teams are in different relationships with the organisation, whether they're still undertaking activity and some are furloughed. So for me, it's this notion of the contexts have all started emerging in on each other. So we now have our work lives, our home lives, and people's capacity to take all that on is extremely stretched at the moment, and people are worried about their family lives and other contexts as well as what's happening with work.
Thank you. And who else would like to kind of respond to this question about the scale of the change that we're currently needing to respond to? Karen? Yeah.
So I think we've all probably gone through a similar sequence of events to a certain extent, and the first was from an organisational perspective, an assessment of the cash crisis and the cash challenge. What cash is in the bank, how cash flow is king, and how you reimagine what you're able to do and how you restructure accordingly, making the most of the furloughing opportunities or whatever you need to do for survival. So you've gone through survival mode, and I think many have come out the other side of survival into what we might categorize as a kind of short-term to medium-term response, where we're beginning to imagine when social distancing is relaxed and when there might be an opportunity to recover some form of normal. So I think that sort of second wave of iterating what that might look like is possibly going to feel familiar to many of the people listening in. And then I think many as well are combining that process of that second phase to really thinking about what's next and what the new normal is and what the opportunity longer term is now going to be for the arts, for the sector, and then specifically to your organisation. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think the other thing to just sort of take on board is the speed that all this has moved at. It's 7 weeks. It's unbelievably fast, and and people have had to do enormous shifts. I mean, 180 degrees for their home life, their friendships, their businesses, and that is exhausting. And I don't underestimate how discombobulating it's been for people, and they've worked incredibly hard and given it their all, and now they're trying to do the next thing and predict what we will need to do in 6 months' time. And I think at some points in this very, very weird journey, we just also need to give ourselves a bit of recovery time, even though everything inside us is going, I have to know the answers and do it now.
Yeah. Rachel, just to add to that, sometimes it can be helpful, but with people to think in terms of change points, and that we can start the day or the week or the month with a sort of bank of so many change points. And usually we can spend them in a reasonably balanced way if we're kind of doing change at work or change at home or change in other aspects of their lives. But now we're spending those change points really quickly. And often by the end of the day, I think most of us are feeling pretty shattered with what's going on.
Thank you. Anna, you were going to...
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I've been struck by how much new stuff people are, you know, how far people have moved their models in a really, really short space of time. And normally, if you're thinking about a business planning exercise, there's some part, well, certainly in the way that I love to do it and I feel comfortable doing it, there's a moment of reflection and analysis and all that kind of stuff. Where we are and what Karen kind of was articulating is that we're moving on to that next step of thinking about what's ahead without having much opportunity to ground from what we've just come through. And so to be acting and reflecting and planning all at the same time, you know, it's extremely demanding, and somehow making space for some of that, like, we have just achieved an extraordinary change, even in one tiny part of our operation or our model or whatever. What could we ground from that? How can we just take, as Andrea says, a little moment to be kind to ourselves and celebrate something that was really great from that, or some lesson that we definitely is worth applying before we go into the next cycle and the next cycle and stuff like that. So yeah, moving into action as well as planning is just like keeping, I have this image in my head of multiple plates spinning, and the task, I think, in business planning is like, which are the most important plates to spin, and what is the logical approach? Do I spin from the ends out, or do I, you know, spin two at a time and then come back? Is working out what's that game plan to kind of managing that process.
Thank you very much. I mean, it certainly feels to me like we've not even talked about really the disease in our first kind of conversation, you know. So on top of all of that, people are in fear of their own well-being. They are fearful about their children, their elder relatives, their neighbourhoods, their communities. People have been losing, and people have been very sick, and people have been bereaved, people have been losing family members and friends. And in lots of cases, I feel like the people that we're now asking to lead our organisations in any other context would be on leave. You know, you'd feel like, if that's what you're coping with, take some time off. And all of us are having all of that, and still having existential challenges for our organisations as well as for our families and our communities. So that brings me to a question, which is, what is a business plan fit for these times? Where do we start with that?
Well, I think we've jacked the old version of business planning out the window for now. You know, this sort of cycles where, you know, you might be preparing something big and very beautiful and very wordy for your key stakeholders, often the arts councils in one place or another. To me, that's just, I love that. It's time to tear it up and put it away, because the top-down kind of 5-year, no, we're not in that. We're in, you know, 3 to 9 months, small cycles, actionable kind of stuff. I think, you know, the sector has so many different models, whether you're a theatre or, you know, a building-based organisation with multiple models within the overall model, or a single touring company trying to deliver a piece of work over, you know, there are lots and lots of different models. And so you can't necessarily reduce all of them to like one page or something, but I think definitely simplicity and brevity and time spent on the thinking and the scanning and the game planning, and not on beautiful prose, I think is definitely where we are.
Yeah, I very much agree with Anna about it's tearing it up. Forget the old notion of a business plan. This is a one-pager. And almost in some cases, I think it's almost startup thinking, because we're moving into a new place, and yes, eventually some of what was familiar may return, but actually it's that really kind of lean startup place. And a bit as Anna was saying earlier, that's then based on good enough information and iteration. It's not based on years of analysis and trends and all of that. It's moving to a very different, much faster, nimbler way of doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's scenario planning, isn't it? It's not a business plan. It's a series of potential possible scenarios that are taking on board the knowledge that you have, and that the external environment knowledge, the external environmental knowledge, the impacts, the stories that you're hearing elsewhere, that are taking that on board, as well as thinking, what can we do? What can we recover? What can we deliver? So it's, you know, what do you want to do? What can you do? And then what will you do? It's that 3 sort of cycle question, I think. So yeah, I very much agree with Anna that this is very much bite-sized chunks. These are small cycles. This requires regular review from boards, from trustees, more meetings than normal. It's, you know, testing your assumptions, and the assumptions that look as if they're going to stick as they go forward is really important, rather than trying to hold on to yesterday, you know, hold on to the beginning of the financial year where we were all projecting that lovely small modest surplus, or or addition to the designated fund for a certain purpose, you know, whatever it was that you were holding on to as a vision is I very much doubt it exists in many places now. So
I would add, what should you do to that list? And I'm a big believer, I've banged on about this before, but I do think boards are there as your weather vane. They are, you know, people with loads of experience in sectors other than yours, and to know what they're thinking and what they're looking at in their business lives is often incredibly helpful, particularly with this short-term chunk, which I think is absolutely the approach.
Yeah. I think for me it links into the sort of scenario planning, but the almost the most powerful question at the moment is what if? What if we went in that direction? What if we went in that direction? So we're absolutely thinking about those multiple possibilities and kind of, you know, stories with a lot of potential endings, and how might we follow each of those through?
I would just, am I allowed to? I would just say, I think it'd be a lot about loosening up. And so going really back to things like the value proposition, not the set of activities that you do necessarily, or multiple sets of activities that speak to that value proposition, not necessarily roles, but what functions do we need to deliver? Because like we said, you know, some staff are furloughed in specific roles, or maybe sick or absent, you know, so that kind of loosening up, and it's steps rather than necessarily always having dates, you know, it's like, what's the sequencing rather than it'll happen on this day and this. So I think that kind of mindset about loosening up helps quite a lot when you're sort of stuck with how on earth do I put this together, you know.
Amazing, thank you. I'm sure I could see some more things that people might say, but let's incorporate them into some more questions. So my next question is, when's the right time for doing this work? Because that sounds like involves reflection and exploration. When's the right time to be doing that, do you think?
I'd say it's ongoing and continuing.
Right now.
Yeah, I think that's why we were slightly bemused looking at you. It's that, well, now.
So I suppose there's some organisations that might need to do other kinds of work right now. I think that's where my question's getting to, isn't it? So what are the different scenarios that might be going on that mean we might have different approaches? You've described an iterative one. What other scenarios might there be that we might need to respond to?
So from our point of view, I suppose we're looking at a multitude of perspectives. So whether that's an organisational resource and capacity perspective, or whether it's a financial perspective, or an audience, participant, young people perspective, or again, a broader sector or organisational or political, or obviously financial. So I think multiple scenarios continually, and just remembering to note the distance that you've travelled. So looking back at where you were last Friday and where you're going to be tomorrow and where we are today, you know, every day is showing new information. So yeah, just multiple perspectives and working on them continually in an overlapping way, whether that's social, partnerships, program, artistic, whatever it might be. Making sure they overlap though and knit together, that they're not developed in isolation, clearly.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly where I'd say it's not necessarily as divorced from those activities in the way that you're talking, Richard. You know, it's very much part and parcel. How's this informing that? What have we learned by doing that slightly different? Or what's it like to now be trying to do all this as a virtual organisation as opposed to what we were? How does that inform our thinking going forward? So it is those steps a bit at a time.
I guess as leaders, sorry, I was going to say that I think you may have to individually ask your colleagues some fairly honest questions, like what point of the day is productive for them to do this kind of work. You know, if people have got small children charging around, there will be particular points in the day they just haven't got headspace for this. And to see in how you can feel a coherent way of sharing this work. It is not necessarily one person's responsibility to do all the big thinking.
No.
Anna.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you know, in some of the conversation here, we're kind of presupposing that kind of a sense of viability beyond the 3 to 6 month period.
Yeah.
And there are some organisations who feel much, much closer up against the cliff face. And there's probably a distinction to be made between a recovery plan to kind of get yourself back on 2 feet, as it were, sort of, as opposed to this, where I think some of the things that we've talked about here have been an assumption about looking forward, seeing some kind of opportunity or some way through. There is the recovery position. There's also decisions around choosing an exit route, whatever that might look like, or how that might be shaped for you, whether that's divesting of some parts of your activity to a partner, merger, or just in some cases ceasing to trade as well. But I think what we're probably making a distinction between is a need for a recovery plan, and Dawn and Susan have produced amazing resources to help with that, and a business plan which is slightly different.
Yeah,
great.
And I'd sort of liken that, sorry, just to add into that, I was going to say it earlier and then it went over my head, it's almost back to kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but thinking of that in organisational terms is absolutely starting with those fundamental hygiene survival factors before you can start to think about some of those kind of higher orders about the big vision and everything. It is absolutely those questions. Can we survive the next month? Can we survive the next 3 months? Okay, we've got that lined up, then where do we go from there? Oh, sorry, I've got cats in the background.
I'm delighted you've got cats in the background. I'd be really glad if you
There's the
didn't.
context, all kind of leaping in on each other.
So that's been really helpful to kind of draw that distinction between, like, are we stable enough at this moment to be able to explore what our future is, or have we got some recovery actions that we need to do in order to just stand upright? But if we are in a moment where we can start to create this iterative, fluid, constantly changing set of what ifs that are our new version of a business plan, then what types of activity need to happen to evolve this? I mean, I think Karen started to talk about some of those conversations. What kinds of exercises or activities or processes can we imagine needing to do in order to generate that kind of fluid business plan that we're talking about? Who'd like to start? Who's got some thoughts on that to start us off? Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, one of the things that you would ordinarily think about is just what's the world in which we're living? Are there any knowns? You know, are there any givens? I think, you know, a really big one, obviously, is that we're in for a deep and prolonged recession. So economic outlook, I think that is given. The exact scale and shape of it, of course, is not known. But over the next 6 months, you know, we know that that's likely to be difficult. So are there some other givens like that that start to shape the world that we've got, and just making sense of some of those things that are happening? You know, digital behaviors, people's behaviors, patterns of consumption, definitely on the change just through this thing. And again, questions about how long they persist, but certainly for the next 6 to 9 months, the period that we're talking about iterating in, some of these things are there. So that would be one place to start, is just kind of orient yourself in that landscape, thinking about what the implications of that for you and your particular form of business, and some of the, perhaps, you know, things like workplace management, how that's going to change and needs to change quite practically. So some of those things would be a good starting point, I think. And then perhaps moving on to a bit of, what are our assets? What have we got to play with? What, you know, in the what's been fantastic, I think, about this is that you've seen organisations responding with every bit of their assets, you know, whether that's your wardrobe mistresses making PPE, using a building for something else. And I think, you know, using your vans for, I think with Birmingham, they're using the vans to deliver stuff to, you know, hospitals and communities and things like that. So we've seen that extraordinary redeployment of asset, and I think that kind of thinking of, like, what have we got and who might need it, and, you know, break it apart, think differently around that kind of thing. Those, I think, would be the sort of starting place. Really, what do people need? What we got? Is there a match between them, and do we need to fill in the gaps somehow?
There's also something for me around scale. So there's been a lot of brilliant stuff done, quite small scale, but very, very replicable. So, you know, the program which really comes to my mind is the Getty Challenge, you know, and that's not been done, you know, from any other heartspring than to say, let's find something that people will enjoy, and has been very creative and very replicable globally. So I think it's quite helpful to know that it doesn't have to be epic stuff. You can really make great stuff, you know, really interesting, useful program. Doesn't always have to be huge.
Right. Yeah. Karen, where would you take this conversation?
I would completely agree with Andrea, actually, about scalability, and actually I'd almost take that a step further and talk about the beauty of the really small. You know, we, for example, at National Youth Theatre, we had a brilliant plan to be working, funded by GLA, working in special needs schools over the next 3 years to encourage creativity, confidence, spoken word, and thinking, how do you translate that desire into continuity of some kind of confident opportunity for young people with learning disability, for example, many of whom don't have access to Wi-Fi in their own homes. So we're thinking about working with Jess Tom of Tourette's Hero on making creative storytelling packs that are like story bags with an online version, but story bags for those that don't have access. And thinking about partnership delivery with local authorities, taking physical resources out to schools. So this is completely unlike anything that NYT might normally do, but it's a creative opportunity for members to be thinking, what is the future of theatre going to be? Is it going to be theatre in a bag? Is it going to be a small, personal, domestic encounter to an audience of one family?
Yeah.
And so using creativity to drive your response, and using that breadth of freelance creative activity that's out there to support different thinking.
Thank you.
Sorry, Richard.
Yeah, go
I
on.
was just going to say is something about the learning and not losing the learning, and how quickly actually people have adapted and responded, and the extraordinary things that are coming out of that. I know there are lots of challenges and, you know, all the rest of it in there, so I'm not making light of that, but actually some extraordinary things have happened very, very quickly. And what is it we could, you know, let's suck all the learning we can out of that, not necessarily, you know, hoping that there's never another experience like this, but actually that keeps us relevant and alive, and really keep shifting as we're going forward.
It's being honest about that, isn't it? Yeah. Between our work brain and our home life, as it were. I mean, I know that, you know, part of me wants everybody to be travelling pretty quickly so that the Everyman and Playhouse can be very busy. And yet I've been asked to go and do something in Scotland. I don't want to go. Not right now. No. You know, and I think being honest about what your own real responses are, as opposed to what would make the business plan work.
Yeah, that's helpful. Really nice. Thank you. So what's apparent in this bit of the conversation is that, of course, the different strands of work that we're thinking about at the moment all interlace, don't they? So we're talking right now about creating a flexible business plan fit for our times. We'll be talking in another one of these conversations about shaping our cultural offer to flex with a sort of post-COVID or with COVID social context. These things interlace, don't they? And we'll be looking at new income models in another one of these conversations, and a new conversation about working practices in another one. But they all kind of end up embedded, don't they, somewhere in the assumptions that are sitting underneath our future business planning right now. But I suppose I've got a couple more questions before we pull this conversation to a close. The next one is, who should be doing this work right now? And of course, lots of us are in fractured or incomplete teams. And so that's part of the context that we're thinking about. So should people be sat at home doing this in isolation? How do we create this kind of business plan that we're talking about at the moment? Who should be doing it? Who wants to start?
I'm happy to kick that from my perspective, and because I have a preference in the way that I work, is absolutely it's still a collaborative endeavour. And I know people might groan, but looking at some of the online tools that are available, and kind of going back to what we were saying before about who's working best when, is that actually if you're using some kind of shared space, is that people can be posting when they're ready to and when they've got ideas, and therefore kind of bouncing and informing each other. And it doesn't have to be the straightforward kind of business planning tools. I know at the moment people are using Pinterest and doing it in a very visual way. You know, there are all sorts of ways you can work creatively, which may help you bring in other members of the team that perhaps might not ordinarily have these kind of conversations, but they can do it in a way that works for them.
Great, thank you. So everyone, who's got a different or wants to elaborate on that perspective?
I was going to add, I came across, I think I spoke about it on another panel, about the role of boundary spanners There's people who, you know, often in organisations, particularly if you don't have a frontline contact role, you're not necessarily in communication with your customers or your direct beneficiaries. We're in different, you know, we've talked about context kind of collapse and how that's changing or shifting. But it does mean that really everybody has an opportunity to be that boundary spanner. Just as the example Andrea just gave about her own willingness or excitement of going anywhere else. You know, we're all risk hunters as well as people kind of putting work out there. And so I think that is a fantastic opportunity. I love Dawn's idea about multiple sort of modes of contribution. I think that's really powerful. I'm always minded of, you know, often a lot of the business plans I see are really narrative heavy, and as we've sort of talked about, this is the time to move away from that, because part of it is that you don't know who is able to read what when. So the clarity of communication, the simplicity of communication is really, really key. And a graph or a picture or whatever can say a thing that replaces a lot of words. So I think that can be really, really powerful. I do think, and I recognise that there are new challenges around sequencing who sees what in what order. So you might before have done a kind of nice parcel to present to your trustees and have maybe more fully formed. And so some of those distinctions between when a trustee might have commented or contributed or whatever might have to fall away. And I think individual organisations might need to find their own sort of little rhythm for how that works best. I think trying to stick to those quite formal, rigid sort of cycles of we do it, you look at it, you know, that might need to fall away a bit.
Thank you, Karen.
I'd add that I think it's really important to make sure that we're listening to artists and to creative people that we would normally be working with as an organisation, or even those that are outside of your usual realm, because artists surely have to be part of the answer to how organisations will fight back. And I think also thinking about the either generational gap of those that are at greater risk of marginalisation. There's been a lot of talk about the class of 2020 for, you know, young people having their voice and their futures taken from them, and that's young people at large. But then think within young people, those that are perhaps at risk of being marginalised, including young disabled people, you know, those that have lost all agency in the world right now. And how do you incorporate what's going to be important to them and relevant to them into your future business model and therefore your cultural offer?
There's something around working with place as well, which will be easier in some places than others, particularly if you've got a group of arts organisations who are used to working collectively. And whilst you might not want to be sharing, you know, your bottom line financials, some of those questions around what are the known knowns, what do we feel people will want to do around particular art forms, about travel, you could have those conversations as a group. You don't all need to do it on your own.
Yeah, and bearing in mind that some people will be far more willing to travel immediately now. I mean, my 18-year-old is itching to get on a train or anything. So being careful that we don't make assumptions about, you know, what our own reaction is to what the reaction of other audiences are, but obviously within the realms of safety and what's appropriate, you know, alongside government guidelines. But yeah, different audience groups are having different responses. Yeah.
Thank you. Anna, you were going to say something.
Well, it was just in connection with that. I think the thing that has struck me very hard is this, you know, we'll have different experiences over the next 6 months of what, because there are a lot of people who won't be coming out of lockdown. I was listening to Miranda Hart talk very powerfully about chronic illness and what it's like for those people. And I think actually there's a duty on all of us to be doubled down on the work that we can offer for those that are still in lockdown, whose need is, you know, really, really very acute in very different ways. And there is a very big group of people who, for whatever circumstances, will still be facing that. So, you know, we'll be balancing that with the need of those that would like to return to normal as well.
Yeah.
I love that. And Michelle Taylor, who's another associate here at People Make It Work, talks in a video on our homepage about, she was drawing out for us, I think, the extent to which many people from the deaf and disabled communities feel themselves to be expert at lots of things that other people in our society feel like they're just learning, that might be about how to protect yourself, might be about how to work remotely, might be about how to use a whole range of communication technologies, might be about finding different ways to share voice or be heard. And so there's another reason to make sure that those communities are heard in our processes. They have a depth of experience and expertise that many other organisations might currently really value. So it feels like there's a sort of many reasons for making sure that inclusivity is there of voice. I think I'm going to come to our final question, which is about opportunities. And I just wondered, what opportunities can you see from that might emerge through this process of business planning and through a process of exploring our futures? What's possible? What possible positive outcomes might there be? Who'd like to help start that, Karen?
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity to embrace change. That we're thinking about the necessary and the immediate responses, of course, but I'm spending time now thinking about what the ideal responses might be, and whether this crisis is creating that opportunity for more of an ideological shift around equality, around access, around that very question I mentioned earlier about young people with disability who might never access theatre, but actually, why can't theatre go to their home in a bag? Yeah. So it's quite an extreme example, but questions of equality, questions of opportunity, questions of fairness, perspective, and let's not waste that. Let's not waste that as a sector. Let's make sure that we embrace it. And we might have struggled to achieve some of those challenges or deliver against some of those challenges when you've got the continuity of normality and that pressure to deliver against business plan, improve upon last year's outputs, last year's outturns. But, we're all back to the beginning now. So it's a real ideological opportunity to embrace equality and fairness.
Thank you. Who else?
I'd add to that, completely agree. I think there's also, if your values are true, and we mentioned earlier that they're the starting point for any planning and discussion, that they're also a pointer for your alliances. So who will be with you, who will you be with, who are you for, and whether that helps us think more broadly. I'm positive, but like Karen, I am slightly worried actually that we have got an even more unequal society coming out of this, and therefore how we can collectively work, for me, is a really important part of the future.
Thank you.
I think mine would link in probably to both of those. I think there's some real opportunities. That's something people will now have been banging on about for a while, is about organisational design. It's a really good opportunity to revisit our structures, cultures and processes. And one of the things I've been doing some work around virtual organisations and with a wholly virtual organisation, and it's really about trust as well, and how trust operates in our organisations, and moving maybe away from hierarchies much more into self-governing teams and working in that way. I think we've also started to uncover there may be some different markets and customers to look at. The Artist Support Pledge has been a great example of that, really opening up a completely new space for artists based on more access and democracy and generosity in a way that hasn't been there before. So I think there definitely are some very interesting opportunities to be looking at going forward.
Thank you. Anna.
Yeah, and I love the whole innovation thing, and I think the flexing of those innovation muscles is amazing. I think I'm filled with hope just watching what the sector's been able to do so far. I'd really like to see people grounding that in learning and improving the kind of prototype to move on to the next model and the next model. But I think, taking what the others have all said, the opportunity to do that with very different partners, it's like, you know, kind of throwing a basket of fruit up in the air and then remaking the fruit salad, you know, like making something really different and fantastic with different partners, with a different organizational structure, but with those values and stuff at heart. So it's about how we give better, do better for the people that we really, really want to serve and entertain. I think I'm excited about the opportunity for innovation and how we ground some of that learning back into what we do more generally.
Great, thank you very much indeed. It's been brilliant to spend some time with you exploring this topic around what is a business plan fit for our times. It's one of 5 topics that we're working on at People Make It Work and Change Creation at the moment. The other 4 around building new working practices for our dispersed and virtual teams and relationships, reimagining relationships with audiences and communities that reflect our new world, exploring new income models and sources of secondary spend, and ticket sales disappear, and thinking differently about value, and finally shaping our cultural offer to flex with a sort of post-COVID or with COVID social context. All of those are being explored right now and will be unpacked in videos just like this one in the coming weeks. Tools that we've been talking about today around enabling us to generate insight, build flexible what-if plans are coming in the following days and weeks to the People Make It Work website and to our Change Creation community. But for now, I'd like to thank the 4 of you for spending time with me today, unpacking this really complex question and bringing some clarity and momentum to what's felt like a really intractable problem. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Richard.
Thank you.